So the next thing that we need to understand is about the component hierarchy. And previously we have seen about the component scope, like a singleton scope, an activity scope, fragment scope. So let us try to understand a bit deeper about it and how we can actually bind and how we can use it. If we are not sure how to bind and how to make use of this hierarchy, then you will face a lot of error and probably you will be unable to build your application, since if the scope doesn't match, it will give us an error and it will be really hard for you to fix if you have a quite big application and if you are not following this particular hierarchy. So let us try to understand and do it in a practical way. We have a singleton, we have make use of activity scope. So let us go back and let us take a look about this activity. So let's say we are injecting this class or the object of the car over here, and this is an activity. And if we go back to the car, and you can see that this is an activity scope, and also this is of the activity scope. And now if I try to change this one to a singleton, and if I try to build an over here, and let us see what we are going to get over here. So we will get an error over here, and it says that the abstract class static singleton implements my application, and this is basically a scope binding error. So you can see the incompatible scope binding, and if you go that the scope with the singleton may not refer a reference binding with a different type of a different scope. So you can also get the error that is activity scoped class, and it's on the class which is of the battery. So we have this class as a car, and this is of a singleton, and it has a dependency of a battery. It has a dependency of the battery, right? And this battery is of an activity scope, so it is not allowed. So you are using over here as a singleton, and here it is of a activity scope, so the scope doesn't match for the dependency. So this class car has a dependency of the battery, and this battery is scoped with the activity, whereas your car class is a scope of a singleton, so it doesn't match it. So it's going to give you an error, so we have to fix this one to match it with a singleton over here. And if I try to run a game, and let's try to see if we are getting any error over there. Let's build. Okay, so it's installing, which means that it doesn't have any error. So which means that if you have a dependency for two and which is scope with a different scope, then you will probably get an error, and it's really, if you have a large application, it will be really hard you to find where you missed or where you misplaced the hierarchy. So if I set it as a singleton, and if I set it as a fragment scope over here, sorry, let's say activity scope, then the build time you will get an error, or the compile time. So it's actually compiling your code, and it will give you an error that there is a scope unmatch. The scope binding is error. One of the activity scope is over there. We have activity scope, and then you have a different scope for your car. This is a singleton scope. And if I have a battery as the activity scope, and then if I set my car as a activity scope, then it matches, right? So the hierarchy matches the activity scope, and your dependency is also of the activity scope, then you will get an will not get an error, because the activity scope over here with the dependency and your car object has the same scope. And also the activity where you are injecting it, we also have to take note where you are injecting that particular class. So for the car, we are injecting it in the activity, so it's good that we have activity scope, or else you have a, let's say I have a singleton scope for this car, and also battery I set it as to a singleton, and then it is injected in my activity, so I will not get any error over here if I try to compile my code. And you can see that it launched successfully because this activity has a singleton which is annotated with a singleton scope for this car, and this battery is also for singleton, but we are using it in the activity. It's not going to get error because this is can live as a singleton which is created on the application level, so it's created on the application level. But if I downgrade now, if I set it as an activity is working fine, if I downgrade to the fragment over here, if I say a fragment scope, and this should be also of a fragment scope, right? Otherwise we'll get an error. Fragment scope, and now this is injected, this car is injected on the activity, and if I try to run it, you will get an error. That should give us an error. Yeah, so now you see that it is a scoping error again. So we have an incompatible scope binding with the activity scope may not refer with a different scope. But where is the activity scope? We are refer it as a fragment scope over here, right? And it says it's a singleton, and we are actually creating my application, so it's the entry point for it's generating all of the class, and we have a singleton, and then it's saying that the fragment scope and fragment scope, two of the classes, one is in the car and one is on the battery. But this is actually going to act saying us that to make use of activity retained or the activity component. So it's actually referring us to make use of the activity retained or the activity component over there on the battery and the car class. But we have made use of the fragment scope over here and also of the fragment scope over here. So how we can fix this one? But we are injecting it in the and the activity. So if you want to inject that one inside the activity, so you must make it as an activity or the singleton over here. If you make it as a fragment and you want to inject it in the activity, it's not going to work. Okay, so we must keep that one. If you want to inject that in your fragment, you must make sure you set it as an annotation with a activity scope or else the singleton scope. And then if I want to inject it in the fragment, then it's not going to give me an error. So let me quickly create a one fragment over here. So let us go and I'll create a fragment with the view model, and let me give the name as something like let's say home fragment. Okay, so now we have a home fragment, and I think I will just cut this section because we are not going to inject it in the activity anymore, and let me inject it in my fragment over here. Okay, I think I'll just cut this and just paste it over here, and then for this I have to move it again. Just let me just paste it over here, and also let me move this log over somewhere here. What I did is I need to cut it and then paste it over here. Okay, and then I have removed that injection from the dependency injection from my activity and move it to my fragment. So I have injected it over here. Since I want to do some dependency injection, I have to make use as a add Android entry point. So make sure whenever you want to have some dependency injection, you must annotate it with the add Android entry point. Please make sure that all of the dependency is available over here. So we will now try to run our application, and we have a two battery is a fragment scope and the car is of the fragment scope. And then we have injected it in the fragment, then we don't get any error. The application will run fine. You can see that your application is run. We are not launching any fragment over here, but it's a build time or your compile time. So the Hilt is actually going to check everything on the compile time. So if you have an error whenever your application is building up, it will give you an error. Since this scope is of a fragment scope and of the battery is also of the fragment scope, and we are injecting it in our fragment, then it's going to perfectly work fine, right? So even if you change this one to let's say singleton, and this one also you have to change it to the singleton, and then I can just run it again. It can launch perfectly and we don't have any error over here. And similarly, if you want to change this one to like activity scope, and also this car as a activity scope, and now if you try to run it, it should work fine because you are injecting in a fragment and your activity scope is higher to this particular fragment, right? So it will work perfectly fine. So you have activity scope and the also the car as an activity scope, but you're injecting in the fragment, so it will work perfectly fine. If you go to hierarchy, since we are using the activity scope, and this activity scope has a higher of the fragment scope, then you are going to it's going to work fine. You have activity scope, you are injecting it in the fragment, then you can have a hierarchy over there. But if I go back to my application, and if I change this particular to the different, like let's say we can make use of a view scope over here, and also of this one as a view scope. So we need to make sure that we follow the same hierarchy of the view scope for our dependency. And if I try to run this one, then again you will get an error of a view scope because we are injecting it in the fragment, and the fragment, if you take a look over here on the hierarchy over here, your view scope is lower to the fragment. So whenever you are referring to a view scope and you are injecting into the fragment, it's not going to work. But if you have a view and if you are annotating it with the fragment scope, then it's perfectly going to work fine. So it's maybe a bit confusing at the first time, but try to practice it, and you may understand it properly. So just make sure you try to practice it, and if you don't practice it, it's not going to get inside your head. It may be a bit confusing if you don't have experience with the previous dependency injection or the dagger. It may be a bit confusing for you to get started over here. Just try to make sure you understand it, because you need to follow the hierarchy, otherwise you will get an error. And you need to know if you are annotating with the activity scope, where you can inject that one. If you are annotating it with the fragment scope, where you can inject that particular object. So you have to make you understand it, otherwise you will face a lot of error when you are doing a dependency injection using a Hilt or the dagger. It's the same.